I was standing at the pump of a Conoco station outside Missoula, Montana, trying to buy $19 of gas, when my card got declined for the third time in a row. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, cold enough that my breath was fogging in front of me, the mountains behind the station already dusted white from the season's first real snowfall. I remember the smell of diesel and cold pine in the air, the same smell that's followed me around this valley my whole life, and I remember thinking, in the ordinary way a man thinks about ordinary things, that I'd need to check whether the bank had put some kind of hold on the account after a recent statement I hadn't looked at closely. The kid working the register that morning, a boy who couldn't have been older than 19 himself, looked at me with that particular kind of pity young people give old men who can't seem to work a machine. I told him to try it again. He did. Declined again. I stepped outside, called my daughter Meredith, because the card belonged to an account she'd been managing since my hip surgery 2 years back, and I asked her, plain as I could, why my card wasn't working. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you somebody's deciding how much of the truth to give you. Then she said, "I canceled it, Dad. Grant and I talked about it, and honestly, it's just gotten to be too much." And before I could ask what too much meant, I heard her husband's voice in the background, muffled, and I heard her say to him, not even bothering to cover the phone all the way, I know, he's become such a burden lately." 5 words. Spoken about me, to her husband, while I stood there listening on my own phone at a gas station with an empty tank. If you're new here, welcome to Dadline. I'm the kind of man who never expected to be telling a story like this one out loud to strangers on the internet, but my wife always said the truth has a way of finding an audience whether you go looking for one or not. Stick around because 5 days after that phone call, my daughter would be the one calling me, asking for help she had no idea I was actually capable of giving. Drop a comment on Dadline if you've ever heard someone you love say something about you they never meant for you to hear, hit that like button, and if this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built to tell. My name is Elias Whitcomb. I'm 73 years old. I've spent nearly my whole life growing apples on a piece of land outside Missoula that my own father cleared by hand back in 1951, and for 41 years I ran that orchard as Whitcomb Family Orchards, selling Honeycrisp and Gala and a stubborn old winesap variety nobody wanted anymore except the folks who remembered what apples used to taste like before everybody started chasing the same 3 commercial varieties. My wife Josephine passed 6 years ago from complications after a fall on the ice, right there in our own driveway on a January morning I still can't think about without my chest tightening. She'd gone out to get the mail, same as she had 10,000 mornings before that one, and I found her 20 minutes later when I noticed she hadn't come back in. She lingered 11 days in the hospital before her heart finally gave out from the strain of it all, and I spent every one of those 11 days sitting in a plastic chair beside her bed, holding a hand that had spent 49 years working alongside mine in that orchard. Meredith flew in from a work trip the second day and barely left the hospital either, and I think, looking back now, that shared vigil is part of why I never expected the distance that eventually grew between us. We'd sat together through the hardest 11 days either of us had ever lived. It never occurred to me that a smaller, quieter kind of distance could grow up in the years afterward, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a hospital bed or a headstone, just a slow accumulation of things left unsaid. Since then it's mostly been me, the dog, and about 2 acres of trees I kept for myself after I sold off the rest of the orchard to a land conservation trust the year I turned 68. Josephine used to tell me something whenever I got too caught up worrying about what other people thought of us. She'd say, "Elias, money talks loud enough on its own. A man doesn't need to shout over it." I've thought about that more in the last 2 weeks than I have since the funeral. I want to tell you about my daughter, because you can't understand what happened at that gas station without understanding who Meredith is and who I let her become, in some ways, without ever meaning to. But before I tell you about her, I think you need to understand the land itself, because everything that happened later grew out of that soil just as surely as the trees did. My father, Elmer Whitcomb, came back from the war in 1946 with almost nothing but a discharge paper and a stubborn refusal to work for anyone else ever again. He bought 40 acres of scrubland west of Missoula for next to nothing, cleared it by hand with an axe and a mule over the course of about 4 years, and planted his first rows of apple trees the spring I was born, 1951. He used to tell me the trees and I grew up together, and in a way that was true. I remember being maybe 6 years old, small enough that my father had to lift me onto his shoulders to reach the lower branches during harvest, the smell of ripe apples and cut grass so thick in the September air that I can still call it up perfectly even now, 70 years later. Josephine came into that orchard the way a lot of good things come into a man's life, sideways and unexpected. She grew up in town, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and I met her at a county fair in the summer of 1975 when she wandered over to the Whitcomb Orchard booth asking sharp, pointed questions about pesticide use that most customers never bothered asking. I married her 14 months later, and she moved out to that farmhouse with me, learned to can preserves and manage the roadside stand and raise a daughter, all while somehow never once losing the sharp, curious mind that had first caught my attention at that fair booth. We buried my father in 1988, and I took over the orchard fully that same year, running it for the next 37 years the way he'd taught me, one careful season at a time. I keep thinking about all of that because I think it explains something important about who I was, sitting at that kitchen table across from my daughter, deciding how much of the truth to give her. Meredith is 44 now. She grew up on that orchard, picking apples every fall from the time she could carry a basket, and for a long time, I thought that life had given her the same kind of steady, grounded relationship with hard work and modest living that it gave me. She married a good man, or at least I always believed he was a good man, named Grant Kessler about 19 years ago, and they settled about 20 minutes from me in a nice enough neighborhood on the edge of town, raising 2 kids, my grandson Owen, who's 16 now, and my granddaughter Nora, who just turned 13. I need to explain something about money in our family, because it matters more to this story than almost anything else. My own father, the man who cleared that land by hand, came up during the Depression, and he drilled into me from about the time I could walk that you never talk about money, not with neighbors, not with family, not even really with your own children once they're grown. He used to say that money changes how people look at you the second they know how much of it you have, and that the safest thing a man could do was let people assume less about him than was actually true. I carried that lesson my whole life without ever really questioning it, and when I sold most of the orchard land to the Montana Land Trust 5 years back, at a number that still makes my chest tighten a little when I think about it, I never told Meredith the full amount. I told her I'd sold some acreage and that I'd be comfortable in retirement. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. I kept living the way I always had, in the same farmhouse Josephine and I raised Meredith in, driving the same 15-year-old truck, buying groceries at the same discount store I'd shopped at for 3 decades. Not because I couldn't afford better. Because that was simply who I was, and who Josephine and I had always been, and it never once occurred to me that living modestly by choice would eventually get mistaken, by my own daughter, for living modestly out of necessity. 2 years ago, I had a bad fall off a ladder while pruning one of my remaining trees, shattered my hip pretty badly, and needed a full replacement surgery followed by nearly 3 months of physical therapy. Meredith stepped in during that time in a way that genuinely moved me, driving me to appointments, staying over some nights to help me manage, and at some point during that recovery, she suggested it might be easier if she had access to one of my accounts, just to help pay bills and keep things organized while I wasn't able to get around easily myself. I agreed without hesitation. She was my daughter. Why wouldn't I trust her with something as simple as helping pay my electric bill while I recovered? I didn't think much of it when, a few months after I'd fully recovered and was back to driving myself around just fine, Meredith mentioned that it might just be simpler to keep managing that account the way things were, since we already had the system set up and it saved everybody the hassle of switching things back. I said that sounded reasonable. Looking back now, that's exactly the moment where something quietly shifted, though I couldn't have told you what at the time. Over the following year and a half, small things started happening that I explained away one after another the way I imagine most people do when they don't want to believe something uncomfortable about someone they love. Meredith started commenting, gently at first, about my grocery spending, suggesting I might save money buying the store brand instead of the name brand coffee I'd been drinking for 30 years. I switched brands. It seemed like a small enough thing to give her. She started asking every few months whether I'd considered downsizing out of the farmhouse, since it was, in her words, a lot of house and a lot of yard for one person to keep up. I told her I liked my house. She'd nod and let it go, but the question kept returning, softer each time, the way water keeps finding the same crack in a foundation. About a year ago, I overheard her on the phone with her sister-in-law, grand-sister, not realizing I'd walked into the kitchen during the conversation. She was saying something about how retirement really hadn't left me with much, how she worried about how I'd manage as I got older on, quote, basically just a pension and whatever's left from selling that land. I stood in that doorway for a second, and I had every opportunity right then to correct her, to tell her the truth about what I actually had tucked away. I didn't. My father's voice was louder in my head than my own honesty, and I told myself it wasn't the right moment. Looking back now, I understand there probably wasn't ever going to be a right moment, as long as I kept believing silence was easier than the conversation. 6 months ago, I found out, almost by accident, that Meredith had started paying my property tax bill directly out of the account she managed for me, without asking, explaining afterward that she'd noticed it was due and figured she'd just take care of it since she was already handling my other bills. I could have paid that bill myself easily, several times over, but I didn't say that. I thanked her for being thoughtful. I let her believe she was helping a father who genuinely needed the help. Around that same time, Meredith started bringing up, more directly than before, whether I'd thought about what would happen to the last 2 acres of the orchard once I was gone, whether I'd considered selling them now rather than leaving the decision to her later. I told her I hadn't decided yet, that I still enjoyed working what was left of the trees, and she nodded, but I noticed she'd started researching land values in the area anyway, mentioning offhand numbers from real estate listings she claimed to have just happened to see. I didn't think much of it. Everyone plans ahead. Looking back now, I understand she was quietly trying to solve a financial problem she'd never told me existed, using the only asset of mine she believed had any real value left in it. Then, about 4 months ago, Nora mentioned during one of her visits that her mother had been, quote, stressed about money a lot lately, a comment Meredith brushed off quickly when I raised it, laughing it away as ordinary household budgeting stress, nothing worth worrying about. I let it go, the way I'd let a dozen smaller signals go over the previous 2 years. Josephine's voice arrived that night, gentle but insistent, the way it always did whenever I was quietly choosing comfort over honesty. Money talks loud enough on its own, Elias. But so does silence if you let it sit long enough in the wrong room. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. Part of me, somewhere underneath all that old Depression-era pride, liked being taken care of a little. Josephine had been gone 6 years by then, and having my daughter show up, manage things, worry over me, it felt like being loved in a language I understood, even if the foundation of that language had quietly become something closer to pity than partnership. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until 5 days after that gas station call, was that while Meredith had spent 2 years slowly positioning herself as the responsible one managing her aging, modest father's finances, her own household had been quietly falling apart in ways she'd been too proud and too frightened to tell anyone about, including me. The morning of the gas station, I'd woken up planning an entirely ordinary day, coffee on the porch with my dog, a trip into town for a new pruning saw, dinner alone with the television on low the way I do most evenings since Josephine passed. I drove to the Conoco on Reserve Street, same station I've used for 20 years, and that's when my card declined, not once, but 3 times, in front of a young man behind the register who clearly had no idea what to do with an old man standing there confused in front of him. I called Meredith right there in the parking lot. I want you to understand my tone when I called. I wasn't angry. I was confused, maybe a little worried something had gone wrong with the account, an identity theft scare, a bank error, something practical. That's genuinely all I expected to hear. Instead, I got a pause and then, I canceled it, Dad. Another pause, shorter this time. Grant and I talked about it and honestly, it's just gotten to be too much. I asked her what too much meant, standing there next to my truck with the gas nozzle still in my hand. And that's when I heard it, not directed at me, not even meant for me to hear at all, her voice pulling slightly away from the phone as she answered something Grant must have asked her in the background. I know, she said. He's become such a burden lately. I stood there for a long moment, the Montana wind cutting across that parking lot, and I didn't say anything right away. Finally, I said, "I need to go, Meredith. I'll figure out the gas some other way." And I hung up before she could say anything else. I want to tell you what that word did to me, sitting there on my tailgate for 20 minutes afterward, because I think it's important. Burden isn't a word that stings the way anger stings, or cruelty stings. It's quieter than that, and somehow heavier. Anger tells you someone still sees you as worth fighting with. Burden tells you someone has started counting the cost of you. I drove home that afternoon without buying my pruning saw, without much of anything at all besides that word sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't quite swallow. Josephine's voice arrived that evening the way it always did when I needed her most, sitting alone on that same porch where we used to watch the sun go down behind the orchard rows. Money talks loud enough on its own, Elias. Maybe it was finally time to let it say something. I didn't call Meredith back that first night, or the second. I sat with it. I thought about my father, about the lesson he'd handed down to me about never letting people know the full truth of what you had, and for the first time in 73 years, I started to genuinely question whether that lesson had protected me the way he always promised it would, or whether it had simply left me sitting alone in a gas station parking lot, quietly labeled a burden by my own daughter, because she genuinely believed there was nothing more to me than what she could see. On the third day, I drove out to see an old friend of mine, Walt Pruitt, who'd run the feed store in town for almost as many decades as I'd run the orchard before finally retiring himself a few years back. Walt and I had known each other since before either of us had children, had stood beside each other at more funerals and weddings than I could count, and if there was one man in Missoula I trusted enough to talk through something like this, it was him. I told Walt everything, the account, the property tax bill, the overheard phone call from a year earlier, and finally, the word burden, sitting there in a diner booth over coffee that had gone lukewarm between us while I talked. Walt listened the way he always had, without interrupting, and when I finished, he leaned back and said something that stuck with me. "Elias, you've spent your whole life letting people underestimate you because your daddy told you that was safer. Maybe it was safer for him, back when he needed it. Doesn't mean it's still doing you any good." I asked him what he thought I should do. He shrugged. "I think you should let the truth catch up to whatever's actually going on with Meredith before you decide how to feel about it. Something's not adding up, Elias. A daughter doesn't cancel her father's card over $19 of gas unless something bigger's already cracking underneath her." Walt, it turned out, understood something I hadn't let myself consider yet. That word, burden, hadn't come from nowhere. Something had been building in Meredith's own life long before that phone call. Something she'd kept hidden from me every bit as carefully as I'd kept my own finances hidden from her. Walt, it turned out, understood something I hadn't let myself consider yet. That word, burden, hadn't come from nowhere. Something had been building in Meredith's own life long before that phone call. Something she'd kept hidden from me every bit as carefully as I'd kept my own finances hidden from her. "You know what I think, Elias," Walt said, stirring sugar into a coffee he'd stopped drinking 10 minutes earlier out of pure habit. "I think you and Meredith have been doing the exact same thing to each other this whole time, just from opposite directions. You've been hiding strength because your daddy taught you it was dangerous to show it. She's probably hiding weakness because our whole generation taught our kids the same lesson without ever meaning to, that admitting trouble is admitting failure." He shook his head slowly. "Man like you ought to know by now, secrets don't actually protect the people you love, Elias. They just delay the day both of you finally have to look at each other honestly." I didn't have much to say back to that. I drove out to the cemetery on the edge of town after I left the diner, something I did maybe once a month, and sat for a while beside Josephine's headstone, the granite already starting to weather at the edges after 6 Montana winters. I told her about the gas station, about the word burden, about Walt's theory that Meredith and I had spent years hiding 2 different truths from each other for 2 versions of the exact same fear. I don't know if talking to a headstone does anything for the person underneath it, but it's always done something for the man doing the talking, and that afternoon was no different. I left that cemetery with less anger in my chest than I'd carried in with me, and something closer to resolve in its place. I didn't reach out to her over the following 2 days. I let the silence sit, the same silence Walt had encouraged, though it cost me more than I let on. I thought about calling Owen or Nora directly, just to hear their voices, but I decided against even that, worried it might feel like I was trying to use the grandchildren to get to their mother. The fourth day was harder than the first three combined. I woke up early, before the dog even stirred, and found myself standing in the kitchen staring at the phone on the counter, my thumb hovering over Meredith's name in my contacts more than once that morning. I didn't call. Instead, I drove into town and spent the better part of the afternoon at Douglas Kim's office, not for any scheduled meeting, just to sit across from a man I trusted and talk through, out loud, what it might actually look like to finally tell my daughter the truth about the investment account after 5 years of silence. Douglas, careful as always, didn't tell me what to do. He simply asked me one question that stuck with me the rest of that day. Elias, what are you actually protecting by keeping this from her? Not what were you protecting 5 years ago. What are you protecting right now, today, sitting in this office? I didn't have a good answer for him, and I think that was exactly the point he was trying to make. Instead, I spent those 2 days doing ordinary things, pruning the last of my trees for the season, fixing a fence post that had been leaning since spring, sitting with my dog on the porch each evening, letting my own hurt settle into something quieter than the sharp sting it had been at that gas station. On the fifth day, my phone rang at 7:15 in the morning, earlier than Meredith usually called. I almost let it go to voicemail, still nursing some pride of my own after the gas station comment, but something told me to pick up. "Dad," she said, and her voice sounded different immediately, thin, strained in a way I hadn't heard from my daughter since she was a teenager coming home upset about something at school. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to please not be angry with me." I told her I was listening. "Grant's business," she started, and stopped. Grant had run a small commercial landscaping company for about 11 years, contracts with a handful of local businesses and a couple of the bigger residential developments outside town. I'd always assumed it was doing fine, mostly because Meredith and Grant never gave any outward sign otherwise. Dad, Grant's biggest client, the Copper Ridge development, they terminated the contract 2 months ago. It was almost 60% of our revenue. We've been trying to cover payroll and the mortgage out of savings, but the savings ran out about 3 weeks ago, and yesterday the bank called about the house. We're 2 payments behind, and if we can't catch up by the end of the month, they're talking about starting foreclosure proceedings. I sat very still in my kitchen, coffee going cold in front of me, the same way it had at Walt's Diner 3 days earlier. "Dad," she continued, her voice cracking now, "I know I have no right to ask you this after everything I said, after the card, I know you probably heard what I said to Grant that day. I've been sick about it ever since. But I don't know who else to call. We're going to lose the house. I don't know what else to do." I sat there for a long moment, the same kind of long, heavy silence I imagined she'd sat in 5 days earlier when Grant asked why she'd canceled my card, and I thought about my father's old lesson, about letting people believe less about you than was actually true, and I finally understood, with total clarity, exactly why that lesson had never really been wisdom at all. It had simply been fear, dressed up as caution, and it had cost me the chance to ever let my own daughter know who I really was, until the exact moment she needed to know it most. "Come by the house this afternoon," I told her. "Bring the paperwork. All of it. And Meredith, I need you to be honest with me about all of it, the same way I'm about to be honest with you." She arrived around 2 that afternoon, alone, without Grant, carrying a folder of mortgage statements and past due notices that she set on my kitchen table with hands that were visibly shaking. She looked exhausted in a way I hadn't noticed the last several times I'd seen her, dark circles under her eyes, her usual careful composure worn thin at the edges. She'd worn a heavier coat than the weather really called for, the kind of thing I noticed only because Josephine used to do the same thing whenever she was carrying something heavy she hadn't said out loud yet, as if an extra layer of fabric might somehow hold a person together a little longer. I made coffee while she got settled, mostly because it gave both of us something ordinary to do with our hands while the weight of the conversation gathered itself in the room. When I finally sat down across from her, she pushed the folder toward me without a word at first, and I flipped through it slowly. 2 missed mortgage payments, a notice from the bank referencing the start of a formal review, a stack of past due invoices from suppliers Grant's business apparently owed money to as well. How long has this actually been going on? I asked her. Not the 2 months since Copper Ridge, Meredith. Of it. How long? She was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. Almost a year, she finally admitted. Grant lost a mid-size contract last winter, nothing as big as Copper Ridge, but enough that we started dipping into savings just to make payroll some months. We kept telling ourselves it was temporary, that the spring season would fix it the way it always had before. Then Copper Ridge dropped us 2 months ago, and there wasn't anything left to dip into anymore. Why didn't you tell me? Any of it, Meredith. A year is a long time to carry something like this alone. Because you always seemed like you had just enough to get by comfortably, Dad, and I didn't want to be the daughter who showed up asking her retired father for money he probably needed for himself, she said, her voice cracking. So instead I just quietly took over managing your account, telling myself I was helping you, when really, I think some part of me needed to feel like I was still capable of managing something, anything, while my own house was falling apart underneath me. Before you look at any of this, she said, sitting down across from me at the same table where she'd done her homework as a girl, I need to say something. What I said that day at the gas station, calling you a burden, Dad, that wasn't about you. I need you to understand that. It came out of somewhere so much uglier than anything about you. Tell me, I said quietly. She took a shaky breath. We've been drowning for almost a year, Dad. Grant's business started struggling last winter. Slow season hit harder than usual, and instead of telling anyone, we just kept covering the gap out of savings, telling ourselves it would turn around. It didn't. By the time Copper Ridge dropped the contract 2 months ago, we barely had anything left to fall back on. She wiped her eyes. And this whole time, I've been managing your account, paying your property tax, watching every dollar in your finances while my own house was quietly falling apart, and some sick, twisted part of me started resenting you for it. Not because you actually cost us anything, Dad. Because managing your money made me feel like I was drowning even faster, watching over someone else's finances while I couldn't even keep my own family afloat. So you canceled the card, I said. I told myself it was about simplifying things, taking one more responsibility off my plate before I lost my mind completely, she said. But if I'm honest, some ugly part of me also I resented that you seemed comfortable while we were falling apart, and I said something cruel about you to Grant because I needed somewhere to put all that fear and shame, and you were an easy, unfair place to put it. Her voice broke completely now. I am so sorry, Dad. I felt sick about it every single day since. I let that sit in the room for a moment, the same way Walt had let my own confession sit in that diner booth 3 days earlier. I need to tell you something too, I finally said. Something I should have told you a long time ago. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a folder I'd prepared the night before, after Walt's advice had finally settled into something like resolve. I slid it across the table toward her. Before she opened it, I told her about Douglas Kim, a quiet, careful man who'd been managing money for families around Missoula since the early 90s, a man Josephine and I had first sat down with back in 2003, not because we had much to manage at the time, but because Josephine had always believed in planning for a future neither of us could fully picture yet. When the land trust offer came through 5 years ago, a number large enough that I genuinely sat in my truck in their parking lot for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to sign anything, it was Douglas who helped me think it through calmly, who helped me understand that I didn't need to change how I lived a single day, that I could keep driving my old truck and shopping at the discount store and still, quietly, be a man with considerably more behind him than anyone in town would ever guess by looking at him. I met with him every quarter for 5 years, I told Meredith. Reviewing statements, making small adjustments, watching it grow slowly and carefully the way your grandfather taught me to watch an orchard grow. And in 5 years, sweetheart, I never once mentioned a single meeting to you. Meredith opened the folder slowly, confused, and I watched her expression shift as she read through the documents inside. The sale agreement from the Montana Land Trust, the actual number I'd received 5 years earlier for the orchard acreage, the current statement from an investment account she'd never known existed. Dad, she said slowly, staring at the numbers, her hands beginning to tremble slightly against the paper. This is a lot of money. I had no idea. She looked up at me, something between disbelief and hurt crossing her face. 2 years, did. I've been counting your grocery receipts for 2 years, and you sat there and let me believe you needed help. You're right to be upset about that, I said quietly. I'm not going to defend it as anything other than what it was, a mistake born out of a lesson I never questioned closely enough. That was the point, I admitted. My own father raised me to believe people treat you differently once they know what you have, that the safest thing was to let everyone assume less about you than was true. I carried that my whole life, Meredith, and I let you believe I was living on nothing but a modest pension because it felt safer than the truth, safer than watching how people's eyes might change once they knew. I paused. But watching you struggle in front of me for the last several minutes, ashamed to ask your own father for help because you thought I had nothing to give, I understand now that my father's lesson never actually protected anyone. It just made sure I never had to be truly known by the people who loved me most. She sat there for a long moment, tears falling freely now, looking between the documents and my face like she was trying to reconcile two versions of the same man. I'm not upset with you for needing help, I told her gently. I'm going to help you and Grant, Meredith. But I need you to hear something first, the same way I needed to finally hear the truth about what's actually been happening in your house this past year. This isn't going to be a blank check quietly handled the way you've been quietly handling my account these past 2 years. We're going to do this honestly, out in the open, both of us, starting today. I called Grant myself that evening, something Meredith hadn't expected me to do, and asked him to come by the following morning without her, just the two of us. He arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks, unshaven, his usual easy confidence worn down to something much rawer. We sat on my porch, the same porch where I'd talked to Josephine's memory more times than I could count over the past 6 years, and I asked him to tell me the truth about the business, all of it, without softening any of it for my benefit. He talked for almost an hour about the slow winter, about Copper Ridge, about nights he'd sat in his truck outside job sites too ashamed to come home and tell Meredith how bad things had actually gotten. I kept thinking I could fix it before she noticed how deep the hole was, he admitted. Same as she was probably doing with your account, come to think of it. Guess we're a family of people who'd rather drown quietly than ask for a hand. I told him that ended today, if he was willing to let it, and he nodded, and something in his shoulders eased in a way I don't think he expected it to. What happened over the following months wasn't a single dramatic gesture that fixed everything overnight. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think stories that wrap up too neatly rarely tell you anything true about how families actually heal. I helped Meredith and Grant that same week, enough to bring the mortgage current and buy them breathing room, but I structured it deliberately, not as a quiet rescue slipped under the table the way I'd let my own finances stay hidden for years, but as a real, transparent arrangement. Douglas Kim, my financial planner, sat down with all four of us, me, Meredith, Grant, and himself, and helped put together an actual plan, part gift, part structured loan with terms Grant insisted on including himself, because he told me plainly he didn't want to feel like he'd simply been rescued without earning his way back to solid ground. I respected that more than I let on at the time. Grant, for his part, spent the following months rebuilding his client base almost entirely from scratch, taking on smaller residential contracts he'd have considered beneath him a year earlier, working longer hours than I think even Meredith fully realized. In March, he landed a new commercial contract with a growing hospital campus on the edge of town, not as large as Copper Ridge had been, but steady, and by early summer, the business had stabilized enough that they stopped needing any further help from me at all, something Grant told me himself, with a kind of quiet pride I recognized from my own younger years, that he was determined to make happen as quickly as he honestly could. Grant, for his part, spent the following months rebuilding his client base almost entirely from scratch, taking on smaller residential contracts he'd have considered beneath him a year earlier, working longer hours than I think even Meredith fully realized. In March, he landed a new commercial contract with a growing hospital campus on the edge of town, not as large as Copper Ridge had been, but steady, and by early summer, the business had stabilized enough that they stopped needing any further help from me at all, something Grant told me himself, with a kind of quiet pride I recognized from my own younger years, that he was determined to make happen as quickly as he honestly could. I want to tell you about one particular afternoon in April, because it stayed with me more than almost anything else that spring. Grant showed up at my place unannounced on a Saturday morning, alone, and asked if he could help me with anything around the orchard, no particular reason given. We spent about 4 hours together clearing deadfall and repairing a stretch of fence line, barely talking, the way men sometimes work best together. Near the end of it, sitting on the tailgate of my truck drinking water, he finally said, "I want you to know, Elias, none of what happened this year was ever really about you. I let my own pride convince me I could fix a failing business quietly, without telling anyone, the same way you'd apparently been quietly hiding your own finances for years. Funny how much trouble two proud men can cause a family without ever meaning any harm at all." I laughed at that, genuinely, the first easy laugh I'd had with my son-in-law in longer than I wanted to admit. Meredith changed too, though more slowly and in quieter ways. She started seeing a counselor that spring, something she mentioned to me almost shyly one afternoon while helping me prune the last few trees on my remaining acreage, admitting that the shame she'd carried about their financial struggles had been eating at her for the better part of a year before it ever came out sideways at me in that parking lot phone call. She told me she was working through why she'd felt so compelled to manage every visible detail of my life during that same period, and admitted that some part of her, she thought, had needed to feel in control of something, anything, while her own household felt like it was slipping out of her hands entirely. In April, she asked if I'd be willing to actually teach her and the kids something about the orchard, the pruning, the grafting, things her own busy adult life had never left much room for since she'd married and moved into town. We spent several Saturday afternoons that spring out among what remained of my trees, Owen asking sharp, curious questions about grafting techniques, Nora more interested in picking early blossoms than in anything I was actually trying to teach, and Meredith, working quietly beside me, asking questions about the orchard's history, about her grandfather clearing that land by hand, in a way she'd never once shown interest in during all her years growing up there. In May, she brought Owen and Nora by for what she called, just an ordinary Sunday dinner, and partway through the meal, without any prompting from me, she told the kids the story of the gas station, honestly, plainly, explaining that she'd said something cruel about their grandfather during a hard, frightening time, and that she wanted them to understand that even grown-ups make mistakes they need to own up to and work to repair. Owen, 16 and typically more interested in his phone than family conversations, looked up and said, simply, "Mom, that's kind of brave, actually, telling us that." I watched something ease in my daughter's shoulders when he said it. Nora, quieter than her brother, waited until after dinner, while we were washing dishes together at my kitchen sink, to ask her own question. "Grandpa, were you sad when Mom said that thing about you?" I told her honestly that I had been for a while, but that being sad about something and staying sad about it forever were two very different choices, and that her mother and I had both decided to make the second one. She thought about that for a moment, drying a plate with more concentration than the task really required, then said, "I don't ever want to feel like a burden to anybody." I told her the truth, that anyone worth loving never actually sees the people they love that way, not really, not even in their worst, most frightened moments, and that the word itself usually says a lot more about the fear inside the person saying it than about the person it gets aimed at. In June, almost exactly 5 weeks after that afternoon at my kitchen table, Meredith handed me an envelope after we'd finished a Saturday afternoon of pruning, the first handwritten letter she'd given me since she was a teenager away at summer camp decades earlier. I read it that evening on my porch, the same porch where Josephine and I used to watch the sun set behind rows of trees that no longer stretched nearly as far as they once had. In that letter, she named the specific wrong plainly, the way I'd learned mattered more than any vague, general apology ever could. She wrote that calling me a burden, even in a moment of private panic never meant for my ears, had been the ugliest truth she'd ever accidentally revealed about her own fear, and that she understood now that her father managing quiet dignity through decades of modest living had never once made him a burden to anyone, it had simply made him a man she'd never fully allowed herself to truly see. She wrote that she understood now why I'd kept the truth about my finances hidden for so long, though she gently added that she hoped, going forward, we could build a relationship honest enough that neither of us ever needed to hide something that's significant from the other again, whether it was struggle or strength. I read that letter twice before I called her. I got your letter, I told her. I meant every word of it, she said. I believe you did, I said. And I want you to hear this clearly, Meredith. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. That word, burden, it's not something I'm ever going to fully forget hearing, and I don't think pretending otherwise would be honest for either of us. I paused. But I also understand now that fear can make even a good daughter say something cruel about a father she loves, when she's drowning quietly enough that nobody, including him, ever thought to ask if she needed a hand too. Does that mean you forgive me? She asked quietly, echoing, though she couldn't have known it, almost exactly what I imagine daughters and sons have asked their own parents in kitchens and on porches for about as long as families have existed. It means I already have, I told her. The forgiving was never really the hard part, sweetheart. Understanding where that word actually came from was. And watching you and Grant do the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding, one honest Saturday afternoon at a time instead of one more quiet arrangement handled behind closed doors, that's the part that's actually mattered most to me these past few months. In July, Meredith asked if she could come with me to my next quarterly meeting with Douglas Kim, something she'd never once shown interest in before that spring. We sat together in his small downtown office, Douglas walking through the account the way he always did, patient and thorough, and at one point Meredith turned to me and said quietly, I want to actually understand this, Dad. Not manage it. Understand it so I'm never guessing about you again. Douglas, who'd known our family for over 20 years, smiled at that in a way that told me he understood exactly how much that sentence meant, even if he never said so directly. We spent almost 2 hours in that office that afternoon, longer than any single meeting I'd had there in years, and I left feeling something I hadn't expected to feel about money in a very long time. Lighter. That same evening, driving her back to her house after the meeting, Meredith asked me something I hadn't expected. Do you think Grandpa Elmer would be disappointed that you finally told me? After keeping his lesson your whole life? I thought about that question longer than I probably needed to before I answered her. I think my father gave me that lesson out of real love, in a world that had genuinely hurt him plenty of times for showing what little he had, I said. But I think even he'd have understood, eventually, that the lesson was built for a different kind of danger than the one sitting across the table from me at that kitchen this year. He was protecting himself from strangers who might take advantage. I was protecting myself from my own daughter ever truly needing me. Those aren't the same threat at all, and I don't think he'd have wanted me confusing the two for as long as I did. Almost exactly 6 months after that morning at the gas station, I drove into town on a cold, bright November afternoon to fill up my truck at the same Conoco on Reserve Street, the same pump, the same young man working behind the register, though he didn't seem to remember me at all, which honestly made me smile a little. I swiped my card, the same account, reopened and rebuilt with Meredith's full knowledge this time, out in the open, no secrets buried underneath either one of our pride anymore. The transaction went through clean, first try, and I stood there in that cold Montana wind for a moment just breathing it in, the ordinary, uneventful sound of a machine simply doing what it was supposed to do. My phone buzzed as I was screwing the gas cap back on. Meredith, calling just to check in, something she did most Sundays now, not out of obligation or quiet management, just because she wanted to hear my voice. Hey Dad, she said. Grant landed another contract this morning, the school district's new administration building. Feels like we're actually climbing out of this thing for real now. I'm proud of you both, I told her, and I meant every word of it. We're doing Sunday dinner at our place this week, she said. Owen wants you to help him with a grafting project for his agriculture class, something about wanting to bring an actual Whitcomb apple tree onto the school's demonstration plot. He's been talking about it all week. I stood there in that gas station parking lot, the same place where 5 months earlier I'd heard my own daughter call me a burden without ever meaning for me to hear it, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsteady since that morning, something closer to peace than I think I'd genuinely felt since Josephine passed. Tell him I'll bring the good grafting knife, I said. And Meredith, thank you for calling, just to check in. You don't have to, you know. Not anymore. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. There was a small pause on the line, and then she added, almost like an afterthought, though I don't think it was one at all. I've been thinking about something, Dad. That word I used back in October. Burden. I looked it up a while back, just out of curiosity, what it actually meant, the older meaning of it. Comes from an old word for carrying something, literally, a load someone bears. And I keep thinking the whole time, I had it backwards. You were never the load I was carrying, Dad. If anything, this whole family had been quietly carrying two loads separately, mine and yours, both of us too proud to admit either one existed, when we could have just carried them together the whole time and neither one would have felt half as heavy. I stood there a moment longer in that cold parking lot, letting her words settle the way good words sometimes need a moment to settle before you can properly answer them. I drove home from that gas station the long way that afternoon, past the 2 remaining acres of orchard, bare now under the November sky, waiting for spring the way they'd waited every year of my life. I thought about my father clearing that land by hand, about the lesson he'd handed down to me without ever meaning any harm by it, a lesson about hiding your strength so the world couldn't use it against you. I thought about how that same lesson, carried far enough down through a family, can start to look almost exactly like the opposite lesson Meredith and Grant had been quietly living out in their own house that same year, hiding your weakness so the world couldn't use that against you either. 2 kinds of hiding, I realized, aimed in opposite directions, but built from the exact same fear, and it had taken a $19 tank of gas and a word I was never supposed to hear to finally bring both of those hidden truths out into the daylight where they could actually be dealt with honestly. I think a lot these days about the word burden itself, about how strange it is that a single word, 5 letters long, said in a moment of panic never meant to reach my ears, could carry the weight of 3 generations of a family quietly hiding things from each other out of love gone sideways. My father hid his strength from strangers because the world had taught him strength invited danger. I hid my strength from my own daughter because I'd never questioned whether that lesson still applied to the people who actually loved me. And Meredith hid her weakness from me because somewhere along the way, she'd absorbed the same quiet family teaching in reverse, that admitting you were struggling was its own kind of danger, a danger to how people saw you, a danger to how much they might come to expect from you afterward. None of us ever sat down and taught each other these lessons directly. We just lived them, generation after generation, until a word slipped out sideways in a gas station parking lot and finally forced all 3 of us to look at what we'd actually built. If there is one thing I hope you take away from our story here on Dad Line, it's this. Pride, the kind my own father handed down to me, the kind that convinces you it's safer to let people underestimate what you have than to risk them treating you differently once they know the truth, that pride doesn't actually protect the people we love. It just makes sure we're never fully known by them until circumstances force the truth out into the open anyway, usually at the exact moment it's needed most and least expected. My daughter was never truly cruel, not in her heart. She was a frightened woman drowning quietly in a shame she was too proud to admit, standing right next to a father who was drowning just as quietly in a pride he'd inherited and never once questioned. Real justice in a family isn't about proving someone wrong, or making them regret what they said. It's about finally telling each other the truth, all of it, the hard parts and the strong parts both, before shame and pride get the chance to build a wall neither one of you ever meant to build in the first place. The following April, almost a full year after that morning at the gas station, the 2 remaining acres of the orchard bloomed the way they always do, white and pink blossoms opening up across those old rows my father planted the spring I was born. Meredith came out on a Saturday with the kids, and Owen brought a small grafted sapling from his agriculture class project, a Whitcomb apple tree that had spent the winter growing in a greenhouse at his high school, ready now to be planted properly in the ground. We put it in together, the 4 of us, Nora patting the soil down around the base with far more seriousness than the task probably required, and when we finished, Meredith stood back and looked at that small tree for a long moment. "Grandpa Elmer would have liked this," she said quietly. "A new tree, going into ground he cleared himself." "He would have," I agreed. "He always said an orchard tells you the truth eventually, whether you're ready to hear it or not. You plant something and years later, it either bore fruit or it didn't, and there's no hiding from which one actually happened." Meredith was quiet for a moment, watching Nora fuss over the new sapling. "I think that's what scared me most this whole year," she finally said. "Not the money. The idea that if anyone really looked closely at what Grant and I had built, they'd see it hadn't actually borne any fruit at all, that underneath everything we were failing. She looked at me. I didn't want you to see that. And I think, somewhere underneath it, I didn't want to see it myself either. You're not failing anymore, I told her. Neither is he. I've watched both of you do the hardest kind of rebuilding there is this year, the kind nobody claps for, the kind that just quietly happens one honest morning at a time. I nodded toward the new tree. That's worth more than anything I could have handed you 5 days after that phone call, sweetheart. Money fixes a mortgage payment. It doesn't fix the thing underneath it that made you afraid to ask for help in the first place. You two did that part yourselves. She hugged me then, right there among the blossoming trees, longer than either of us probably expected, and over her shoulder I watched Owen and Nora arguing good-naturedly about whether the new sapling was planted perfectly straight, the same kind of ordinary, unremarkable family argument I'd watched Meredith herself have with her own mother in that same orchard 40 years earlier. If this story moved you, hit that like button, drop a comment on Dadline, and tell me if you've ever kept a truth hidden from someone you love out of pride or fear, and subscribe to Dadline if you want more real stories like this one. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Dadline. I hope you and the people you love always choose honesty over pride, long before life ever forces the choice for you.